Welcome back, and welcome to the second part of plenaries. Some of these will happen in Spanish, so we remind you of the channel. Channel 4 is English, 5 is Francais, and 6 Castellano. We also would like to mention that out of this session, we are very pleased to acknowledge the contribution of the World Education Services, who contributed to Latin American speakers.
World Education Services. OK. Seulement pour vous dire, il va y avoir des présentations en espagnol. Donc, vous pouvez synchroniser avec le canal 6 sur vos moniteurs. Et il y a deux des personnes qui sont présentes ici qui ont bénéficié des services du
World Education Services.
Oui, World Education Services qui ont commandité leur présence ici. On voulait aussi vous mentionner que tout de suite après la session, le ministre sera présent. On va prendre des questions pour le ministre. Donc, si vous commencez tout de suite à poser des questions pour le ministre, je parle bien entendu du ministre de l'Immigration du Canada, Ahmed Hussein. Vous pouvez déjà les mettre sur Slido. Par contre, s'il vous plaît, mettre ministre juste avant votre question, qu'on sache si ça s'adresse aux panélistes ou au ministre. Merci.
As you know, the minister is coming at 1 o'clock after this plenary, and he will be able to receive a few questions from the audience. As such, we ask you that when you go on Slido, type minister in capital letters, and we will know that those questions are for the minister. Okay, so thank you for your cooperation. Keep those questions coming. None of them will be thrown away. They will be part of our report. And without further ado, without wasting any time, because we are a little late, mi placer introducir el presidente de esta sesión, el doctor Diego Beltrán. Nació en Montevideo, Uruguay. Tiene una formación profesional en Derecho, una maestría en formación profesional de Relaciones Internacionales y Negociaciones Internacionales, formulación de política. Con más de 28 años de experiencia en el ámbito internacional, ha dirigido programas y proyectos de cooperación técnica sobre gestión, gobernanza de las migraciones, con enfoque en las políticas públicas sobre derechos humanos e migrantes. En octubre del 2012, Diego Beltrán asumió como director regional de la oficina de la OIM para América del Sur, desde la cual se apoyan y orientan las actividades de la organización en Argentina, Bolivia, Brasil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Perú, Uruguay y Venezuela. Es un gran placer dar la bienvenida al doctor Diego Beltrán.
Good morning. Thank you so much for the presentation. Good morning to everybody. Let me start thanking the government of Canada and particularly the Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship of Canada and all the sponsors for this invitation to participate in the very well-known Worldwide International Metropolis Conference 2019. Let me also congratulate the organizers of conveners of this event for selecting the topic of South-South migration. This is as not only timely but pertinent discussion. As is stated in the invitation, South-South migration flows in the past received comparatively less attention by academic researchers, national governments, and the international community in general. However, globally, the South-South migration represents currently 36%. This says 82 million persons of the total stock of migrants. In some regions, such as South America, the South-South flows is the 70% of the migration flows in the region. And in some countries of South America, the intra-regional migration, the South-South represents more than 80% of the flows. The current massive flows of Venezuelan refugees and migrants, with more than 4 million Venezuelans that left the country in the past 3 years, that are the majority of them located in the Latin American Caribbean countries, tend to consolidate these trends. It's in the sense that South-South migration is increasingly capturing the attention of policymakers. Recently, the second UN high-level conference on South-South cooperation that took place in Buenos Aires included in the agenda the cooperation on migrations on South-South cooperation for the first time. In the same line, the UN Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes migration governance as a main indicator of progress, constitutes a key tool to address also the South-South migration flows. Finally, I would like to mention that there are certain spaces that are successfully working on South-South cooperation throughout the past year, that are the regional, the RCPs, the regional consultative processes. Having said that, I'm privileged to be here with the accompaniment of these selected panelists, and I'm more than privileged, and it's a great honor to introduce the next speaker, which will open this panel, which is Vice Minister of Human Mobility of Ecuador, Mr. Santiago Chavez. Ambassador Santiago Chavez has 38 years of experience in the diplomatic career. Since June 2018, he is the Vice Minister of Human Mobility. His actual functions are related to the integration of the returned migrants, protection of foreign citizens, prevention of xenophobia, risky migration, and improvement of migratory services. He has directed processes and events at national, regional, and international level. Among them, the holding of 3 regional technical and human mobility meetings for Venezuelan citizens within the framework of the so-called Quito process. Since December 2018, Vice Minister Chavez holds the presidency of the Global Forum of Migration and Development 2019, in which he has brought together experts from various countries in areas of economic, social, and political development. Tengo el honor entonces de pasarle la palabra al viceministro Santiago Chavez, quien ha liderado lo que es considerado una buena práctica que va a ser presentada en este momento, que es el proceso de Quito. Adelante.
Okay, thank you very much, Diego. Good morning, all the people here. Dear panelists, thank you very much for to share this this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject of this table is the South-South cooperation in migration issues. I have to begin assuring you that cooperation truly is one of the key elements related with migration and mixed flows today. The whole world is facing big challenges about migration, and this is now a transversal issue in the internal and international agendas of most of the countries. International organizations like those of the United Nations system, but also for other key actors as the civil society, the private sector, or the academia. With them an extensive scope, the philosophy of the South-South must be one: inclusiveness, in a context of an appropriate environment that permits plural arrangements. The existing framework has not been able, in a general sense, to address the challenges that is facing now the South-South cooperation, and of course, those related with migration. My country's government, Ecuador, thinks that strengthening the international map of managing social cooperation at the regional and international levels is now a priority. Following the guidelines of the national plans of development and the spirit of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, in particular regarding our case, the objective 10.7, facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. Ecuador is working hardly to do that. We are working mainly in two fields. The regional, to contribute to find a good articulation before the humanitarian crisis of the Venezuela's nationals, and internationally, as presidency of the World Forum for Migration and Development. In both of them, Ecuador has been trying to integrate government, international entities, civil society, private sector, academia, etc. Well, I am going to change to Spanish. Déjenme decirles que para conseguir una articulación como la que nosotros estamos procurando, intentamos ante todo establecer un modelo de gestión que nos permita encontrar la mayor cantidad de consensos posibles, la mayor participación, la mayor motivación de la gente a nivel interno, contando con una estructura nacional que nos permite realmente llegar a todo el territorio del país y procurar, como digo, que participen todos los sectores. De esa manera podemos nosotros conseguir ciertos consensos que nos permiten, por ejemplo, proyectarnos como lo hemos hecho a nivel regional, llevando adelante la iniciativa del proceso de Quito. El proceso de Quito, que ha tenido 3 reuniones en las que han participado todos estos actores que yo he mencionado. La idea es justamente la inclusividad que nos permita primero encontrar un espacio de diálogo y luego un espacio de búsqueda de soluciones a los problemas. Solo de esta manera creemos nosotros que podemos entender lo que todos necesitamos, lo que todos requerimos además, y sobre todo lo que requiere en este momento la gente más necesitada, la gente en movilidad humana, los flujos mixtos de migrantes y de refugiados. De tal manera que en la primera reunión del proceso de Quito nosotros establecimos con varios países de la región, con países también desarrollados que pueden ser potenciales donantes, con los organismos del sistema de Naciones Unidas que tienen una vinculación directa con los temas de movilidad humana y en particular de migraciones, con la banca internacional, con la sociedad civil. Digo, establecimos un diálogo que nos permitió marcar y señalar cuál sería el camino que la región debía seguir en lo que se relaciona con esta crisis específica de la migración venezolana. Una migración, por cierto, forzada, una migración no voluntaria. Muchos países la han calificado como resultado de una crisis humanitaria. Varias organizaciones de Naciones Unidas también. El tema siguió en la segunda reunión con la presentación de un plan de acción que nos permitió básicamente articular las acciones que podían llevar a cabo varios gobiernos, acciones muy concretas en beneficio de la gente, pero también para establecer políticas públicas que permitan en un momento dado dar respuestas eficaces a esta situación. Una tercera reunión nos permitió valorar, nos permitió mirar cuáles habían sido los resultados de la implementación del plan de acción de Quito. Asimismo, nos permitió establecer que era importante dar continuidad al proceso de Quito mediante la realización de nuevas reuniones internacionales, quizá contando con un mayor número de actores, pero también tratando de que este proceso de articulación entre todos estos participantes que he mencionado pueda reproducirse y pueda constituir una buena práctica internacional. Entonces, el 4 y 5 de julio, el proceso de Quito va a continuar con lo que se denomina el capítulo de Buenos Aires y después continuará también con una quinta reunión que ya está programada en la capital de Paraguay, en Asunción, seguramente en el mes de septiembre. Debo decir que no es fácil poder afrontar una situación de esta naturaleza. El caso concreto de la migración venezolana. Naciones Unidas ha establecido que para finales del mes de diciembre de este año tendremos alrededor de 5.400.000 personas de nacionalidad venezolana en situación de movilidad humana. 5.400.000, de los cuales la gran mayoría se queda en América del Sur, en los países de América del Sur. De estos países hay 3 que son particularmente afectados por esta situación, que son Colombia, Ecuador y Perú, los países de alguna manera a los cuales los nacionales venezolanos han preferido migrar. Países como el mío, Ecuador, es una nación que se ha convertido en un país de origen, receptor y también un país de tránsito en materia de migración. Desde el año pasado recibimos más de 1 millón de migrantes venezolanos y ahora nosotros tenemos, de más de 1 millón, vamos a decir que 900.000 aproximadamente estaban en tránsito. 900.000 personas a las cuales hay que suministrarles una serie de servicios y una serie de elementos que les permita alcanzar, digamos, sus objetivos. En este caso, desde los servicios que se requieren dentro de lo que se estima que es la asistencia humanitaria cuando ingresan al territorio nacional, hasta todo lo que se relaciona con salud, alimentación durante el tiempo que transitan por el país, y aquellos que deciden quedarse, pues la Constitución del Ecuador establece que ellos tienen los mismos derechos que los ciudadanos ecuatorianos. Entonces, tienen derecho, como digo, a educación, salud gratuita, tienen derecho también, en caso de que puedan regularizar su situación migratoria, a insertarse normalmente en el mercado laboral. Lamentablemente, uno de los problemas fundamentales que hemos afrontado, no solo el Ecuador, sino todos los países de la región, radica en que muchas personas no cuentan con documentos. Al no contar con documentos, por ejemplo, no tienen pasaportes o no tienen cédulas de identidad, no tienen otros documentos, partidas de nacimiento, cosas así, que eso dificulta mucho su regularidad migratoria. El Ecuador ha otorgado más de 100.000 visas a ciudadanos venezolanos. Asimismo, viene llevando a cabo una serie de estudios técnicos que permitan implementar en el momento oportuno, probablemente sea durante este año, un proceso extraordinario de regularización migratoria para los ciudadanos que no cuentan con esos documentos, porque lo mejor que le puede pasar, creo yo, y estoy convencido de eso, a un país es justamente regularizar la situación migratoria de las personas irregulares. No puede ser factible que personas que ya se quedan a residir en un país no tengan sobre todo posibilidad de insertarse en el mercado laboral. Eso impide que ellos puedan ganar normalmente su sustento y lógicamente tener una vida común y corriente, como las que tenemos todos los que estamos aquí presentes. Entonces se ven sujetos muchas veces a una serie de situaciones lamentables, a una serie de abusos, por ejemplo, en cuanto a la paga por los servicios que prestan en materia laboral. Bueno, en este contexto, varios países de la región ya han llevado adelante procesos de regularización migratoria. Otros lo vamos a hacer. Entonces, el proceso de Quito ha servido, por ejemplo, para esto, que es una de las cosas más importantes dentro de lo que es la movilidad humana de los nacionales venezolanos, pero también para otras cosas muy concretas, por ejemplo, para reconocer pasaportes caducados, en vista de que hay una dificultad del gobierno venezolano de otorgar pasaportes a sus nacionales. Nosotros lo que hacemos sencillamente es, a nivel de región, algunos países lo han aplicado y otros no todavía, pero tienen dentro de los compromisos la posibilidad de hacerlo a corto plazo. El reconocimiento de pasaportes caducados. La Asamblea Nacional Venezolana ha establecido un periodo adicional de 5 años de vigencia de sus pasaportes y muchos de los países de la región están acogiendo eso y lo están aplicando. Otra de las cosas importantes es la reducción o la condonación de multas, por ejemplo, para los nacionales venezolanos. Gente que llega prácticamente sin recursos, sin nada, llegan a los países y entonces se ven sujetos muchas veces a pagar multas por su situación de irregularidad migratoria. Además, eso está directamente conectado con la imposibilidad de regularizar su situación migratoria en caso de que no hayan sido canceladas esas multas. Así que, yo he citado solamente unas poquitas cosas de las que se van logrando en el día a día y algunas políticas que se van estableciendo. Debo decir que dentro de lo que es la concepción del gobierno del Ecuador y sobre todo llevando también una concordancia con la presidencia del Foro Global de Migración y Desarrollo, nosotros le damos mucha importancia, mucho énfasis a lo que tiene que ver con el tema de migración y desarrollo. Justamente es eso en lo que debemos enfatizar. Debemos tratar de que los países desarrollados, los países donantes, que la banca internacional se sensibilice más con este tema, se dé cuenta de que es un problema que debemos afrontarlo dentro de los parámetros de corresponsabilidad y debemos colaborar. Uno de los obstáculos fundamentales para avanzar en esto radica justamente en la falta de recursos. Un país como el Ecuador ha hecho una cuantificación de lo que necesita de aquí hasta 2021 para afrontar la crisis venezolana, sobre todo lo que tiene que ver con inserción de nacionales venezolanos, y hemos llegado a que el Ecuador, solo el Ecuador, necesita 550 millones de dólares en ese periodo. Otros países que reciben más migrantes, más refugiados por esta crisis específica, requieren inclusive cantidades mayores. Así que esto se contrapone realmente con lo que constituye la realidad de la ayuda internacional. Como mencionaba antes, en este tema de movilidad humana, el asunto de la cooperación es vital, es fundamental, es uno de los pilares realmente en los cuales la solución para los problemas de movilidad humana se fundamenta, la cooperación internacional. Y el otro problema es, claro, el financiamiento. Y de ahí tenemos una serie de dificultades específicas, ¿no?, que cada gobierno tiene que resolver y que asimismo podemos resolver en algunos casos de manera conjunta. Y digo de manera conjunta porque una problemática de esta naturaleza es imposible de resolver de manera individual. Es imperativo que haya una coordinación, es imperativo que haya una articulación y que en esto participen todos los actores. Desgraciadamente, en algunas regiones del mundo es muy difícil encontrar consensos y inclusive es muy difícil llevar adelante diálogos sobre temas de movilidad humana, sobre temas de migración. A veces la incidencia de la política también influye enormemente en el trabajo técnico y resulta muy complejo poder llegar a obtener resultados satisfactorios. En el caso del proceso de Quito, nosotros creemos haber logrado en una primera fase resultados realmente satisfactorios. Han participado varios países de la región de Sudamérica, pero también de Centroamérica y algunos del Caribe. Ha participado también México de América del Norte. Entonces, esto revela en gran medida que es importante aprender de los demás, compartir las experiencias. Tenemos también una crisis en Centroamérica, crisis migratoria de gente que va hacia los Estados Unidos y se están pensando en algunas ideas. Digo, por ejemplo, en el tema de migración y desarrollo, es necesario invertir en emprendimientos, invertir en facilidades, en infraestructuras. Es necesario generar fuentes de empleo para efecto de que la gente que migra se quede en condiciones dignas en sus países. Entonces, es necesaria más articulación y más diálogo a nivel internacional. En el campo regional, debo destacar la ayuda también, la cooperación, el importante trabajo que realiza el sistema de Naciones Unidas. Sin el sistema de Naciones Unidas sería muy difícil seguir avanzando. Ellos de alguna manera coadyuvan en sus respectivas competencias a alcanzar los objetivos de los gobiernos y especialmente están también en muchas situaciones difíciles velando por el bienestar de la población en movilidad humana. Yo creo que me voy a quedar ahí para continuar después con otros temas específicos. Si te parece, Diego, podríamos, creo que ya me he extendido bastante, pienso que podríamos dar la palabra a otro panelista y seguimos en el momento de las preguntas. Gracias.
Many thanks, Vice Minister Chavez, for presenting this really best practice on South-South migration flows and what is considered an inspiring and different model, a generous model to facilitate, to address an unprecedented massive flows of Venezuelan refugees as migrants, which, as you explained, many of them travels without any travel document. We look forward to see the outcomes of the next Quito process meeting in Buenos Aires. Having said that, let me introduce the second speaker, Dr. Silvia Núñez Garcia, professor of the CISAN UNAM. Dr. Núñez is former director of the Center for Research on North America, CISAN, at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where she also holds the position of tenured researcher of USA-Mexico relations since 1989. Her field of expertise is social inequality, migration, and gender in North America. She was awarded a fellowship from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and has been a visiting scholar in prestigious institutions such as Georgetown University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She is a member of Metropolis International Conference and acted as the academic chair of the Metropolis International Conference in Mexico City 2015. Dr. Núñez, the floor is yours.
Muy buenas tardes, tengan todos y todas ustedes. Es un placer para mí tener la oportunidad de estar en esta conferencia Metrópolis 2019. Quisiera comenzar por agradecer de manera muy especial al Gobierno de Canadá el haberme invitado a esta sesión y también expresar mi gratitud a Enrique del Castelo, quien tuvo la confianza en proponerme para esta gran responsabilidad. Quiero agradecer también a los que me acompañan en el panel, todos distinguidos expertos en el tema de la migración, y decirles que me da sobre todo un enorme orgullo que en medio de circunstancias muy complicadas vengo a representar a mi país. Quisiera empezar por decirles que mi exposición será muy breve. La voy a hacer en inglés. I will turn into English, although my text in English is going to emerge quite frequently. And I will begin by saying some context and facts regarding the situation we face in Mexico. First of all, you need to understand that Mexico has not seen itself as a receiving country. We always were working on Mexico as an emigration, basically to the United States. And what is happening right now is truly making us see each other in a mirror. So first of all, you need to see that the former Mexican government started to establish migratory controls in the southern part of Mexico during the presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto, which, by the way, ended up in November last year. You see in the map all the network of migratory controls basically in the southern part of Mexico. He was absolutely against the Central American caravans, basically coming from the Northern Triangle. And he said that he was not willing to welcome all these people without the proper documentation. Let us not forget that unfortunately Mexico has been trapped along this situation with the debate that emerged in the United States when Donald Trump wanted Mexico to pay for the wall. So President Trump has been threatened not only Mexico, but his peers from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, in terms of imposing economic sanctions if we do not behave well in terms of controlling human mobility in the region. We had a shift from the former government when Andrés Manuel López Obrador came into the presidency on the 1st of December 2018, because during his campaign he mentioned that he was absolutely in favor of an open doors policy with full protection of human rights. So the first day of his presidency, when the same day he took office, he had all this ceremony with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and ECLAC, a representative by Ambassador Bárcena, for signing the agreement to launch the comprehensive development plan for the region, the Northern Triangle plus Mexico. What has happened is that when this was already happening, the number of undocumented Central Americans, with some others, not only Central Americans, transiting into Mexico had already made it, some of them to the northern border, and they were packing up in towns along the US border. And by January 2019, the Department of Homeland Security implemented the Remain in Mexico policy for citizens and nationals of countries other than Mexico arriving in the US by land from Mexico illegally or without paper documentation. So they were sending them all back to remain in northern border cities of my country. By mid-June, the Secretary of International Affairs in Mexico mentioned that around 25,000 irregular migrants were waiting in Mexican towns along the border with the US. These people were expecting the final decision from the United States to let them or not let them in. This is a picture of one of the caravans coming into the southern border. You can see the human dimension. You need to recognize that Mexican authorities have been doing a great effort in order to establish 58 migratory stations and provisional shelters in 23 out of the 32 states in my country. The Mexican Ministry of the Interior has mentioned that the country has registered more than 53,000 irregular migrants coming with the caravans, plus more than 37,000 deportations. This is a picture where you can see very clearly the overcrowding of the facilities we have basically in the southern border, but also in the northern border. It is quite interesting to recognize how difficult that Mexico has always had difficulties in terms of having proven data for many things, not only for migration, but this is now the case. Because if we compare the numbers I just gave you with the data that DHS has regarding the number of apprehensions in the fiscal year 2019, that runs from October 2018 to May 2019, there has been almost 600,000 apprehensions in the US-Mexico border. Out of this number, there is an increasing number of unaccompanied children, that it is almost 57,000 out of the whole number. Just compare the number that we have from October 18 to May 19. If you compare the fiscal year 2018 in the United States, the total number for the whole year, it didn't make it 400,000 apprehensions in the US border. Well, unfortunately, this is the world we live in. We had a president that decided to shift his approach in April. We don't know if this was because already there was a lot of growing discontent in my country, but also an increasing pressure from the United States. I was in the US-Mexico border when he was threatening to close the border, and there were all these complaints of commercial goods not being able to move. But one of the issues that didn't come out specifically in international media was the discontent and the anger of many Mexicans that live in the Mexico side of the border, that have a legal permit and visa to cross every day. They either work or study in places such as El Paso, and they were truly very mad because of this situation created by the members of the caravans. So this has been having an impact in terms of shifting and rebuilding the social imaginary in my country towards migrants. So we have implemented 2 different cards to try to register the newcomers in the caravans. I'm not just going to focus in the second one because it's the one that is implemented. The first one was when the president said we want an open doors policy, but this is now in the past. This is called the Regional Visitor Card. It was originally designed for nationals from Belize and Guatemala, but this has been extended for nationals from Hondurans and Salvadorians. It's only for 5 years. It allows them just to transit within the scope of the map where you see all the migration controls. That means the southern part of Mexico. They want to keep them in that region between Campeche, Chiapas, Tabasco, Quintana Roo, and Yucatan. It's not a working permit. The other image I want to show you is that Mexico has had a very restrictive policy towards refugees. This is what has happened, but no matter that, you see that the number of applications have been growing steadily. If you see 2017 to 2018, it's more than double the submission of applications. Where are they coming from, the people that are requesting refugee in Mexico? Well, from Honduras is the #1, El Salvador the 2nd, Venezuela the 3rd. But if you see the numbers, for example, Honduras, there were more than 25,000 applications and only less than 5,000 accepted. In the case of El Salvador, 1/3 of the applications were accepted, and it is interesting. It was so interesting for me to realize that Nicaragua, for a very peculiar situation, you see that the number of applications is almost the same as the one of that were accepted. So rapidly. This is exactly the same. I'm not going to talk about the deportations from Mexico and the US to Central America, just to let you know, not to forget, that Mexico is the winner in terms of the number of deportees back to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras since the year 2015. So talking about the proposal of ICLAC, between El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, which is a comprehensive development plan developed by ICLAC. We need an estimated $10 billion per year. We don't know where is this money going to come from, still in the making, and contains 30 public policy recommendations and 4 key pillars. I'm not going to talk about the wage. Well, anyway, these 4 key pillars. One is economic development. It highlights taxation and investment, integration of trade, energy, and logistics, social programs including health, education, and employment, environmental sustainability, and integrated management of the migratory cycle. It also incorporates macroeconomics, progressive taxation, strengthened tax administration, transparency, and accountability among them. Which is also very relevant to highlight in terms of this comprehensive development plan for the region, is that it incorporates as a key, the key component is migration management. One, human rights of migrants and refugees at the center of the migratory cycle. The second, principle of non-discrimination in the migratory cycle. 3, care of people displaced by violence and natural disaster. Let us keep in mind why the people from Central America and the southern part of Mexico are moving out of their places. It is because of poverty, it is because of violence, but it is because of corruption and the strengthening of the human traffickers networks in that area. And another element that crosses around this crisis is politics. I don't have time to let you know the stories about what has happened, but changes of government in Mexico and in El Salvador and in Guatemala has coincided. So this initiative is quite innovative. It establishes development space comprising El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico. And it does integrate human mobility into a fair and sustainable development. We need to be very careful that all these people who are really moving know their rights and do coincide with this proposal. I think we should be asking them how do they see their own future and the future of their children. So in order to finish, and let me just mention that this is exactly the best, the way to represent the US-Mexico border, not with bricks, but built up with dollars. And the US-Mexico agreement now, which I call it is an unprecedented one because we are still asymmetrical, we live in an asymmetrical interdependence environment. We don't know if we are friends, partners, allies, lovers, or always distant neighbors. Maybe we are all of that at the same time. So as a part of the agreement, Mexico has agreed to deploy thousands of National Guard members in our southern border with Guatemala in an attempt to reduce the number of migrants headed to the United States-Mexico border. Mexico has committed to taking action to dismantle illicit organizations and network in our southern border, and also has agreed to take in more migrants seeking asylum in the United States while they await the adjudication of their claims. These measures will be evaluated only after 45 days. I think we are running out of time. I've been speaking for the last month about this. In 45 days, Mexico and the US will continue to discuss the terms of this agreement to ensure that the expected results are met, and an announcement on further actions will be made within 90 days. Tariffs still are on the table and could be imposed if the levels of migration are not reduced. To finish, let me just mention, I don't know what happened with my slides anyway. To finish with my presentation, let me just tell you that beyond this wall, Mexico and the US do more than $611 billion trade annually. Imposing tariffs, from my perspective, to certify good performance in border control against irregular migrants could end up having unintended consequences, increasing tensions within Mexico, more violence from gangs and human traffickers, etc. Just last week, by June the 18th, Televisa Network reported that the Mexican National Guard had deployed 1,300 troops in Chiapas. They immediately detained migrants that were unable to demonstrate their legal status in Mexico, and they are requesting Mexicans to show them our voters card. We do not call it ID card, it's the voting card. And if we Mexicans do not have the voting card, they would not allow us even to take a bus from Chiapas to Oaxaca, for example. So, at the end of this tragedy, it's a human tragedy, let me just tell you that I'm very worried about the forging, as I said before, the forging of a new imaginary in Mexico that is already working against irregular migrants. The role of mass media and social media are absolutely decisive in this crisis, as they are framing the conversation. By the way, just some days ago, some journalists were saying that they think that maybe a political party will emerge in Mexico that will propose xenophobic policies. As I must say that policy improvisation is absolutely unacceptable, and that Mexico is in great need of advice and support to overcome this already humanitarian crisis. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
Many thanks, Silvia, to present this dramatic development on the migration flows from Central America to North America, which indeed affects so much the migrants from the Northern Triangle. With the next speaker, we will shift completely regional scope, geographic scope of the presentation. Let me introduce Dr. Andrew Garner, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, United States of America. A sociocultural anthropologist and ethnographer by training, for the past 2 decades, Andrew's fieldwork has been focused on the places, peoples, and societies that interact in the petroleum-rich states of the Arabian Peninsula. He has conducted extensive fieldwork in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Qatar. Between 2008 and 2010, he served as assistant professor of anthropology at Qatar University. In addition to numerous journal articles and book chapters, he is the author of City of Strangers, Gulf Migration and the Indian Community in Bahrain, Cornell 2010, which explores the experiences of Indian transnational migrants in Bahrain and the society that hosts them. His current pursuits explore the juncture between transnational migration, urbanization, and urban planning in Doha, Qatar. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really, really honored to be here speaking with you. I think I, like other speakers, have way too many things I hope to tell you in the next 15 minutes. I welcome my participation on this South-to-South migration panel because, like other speakers, not concerned with migration to North America or Europe. That's what we share. But I think what's unusual about Gulf migration is that the receiving countries that many of the migrants I study are going to are, on a per capita basis, some of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest countries in the world. So there is that difference. And I also want to recognize, with the amazing cosmopolitan diversity of this audience, that there are certainly others in this room that likely know as much, if not more, about this migration than I do. But without further ado, we'll go here. So by some accountings, migration to the Arabian Peninsula is the third largest transnational movement of humans in the contemporary world, after Europe and North America as destinations. My understanding of this migration flow, and I've been studying this for 2 decades using ethnography, and my understanding is multi-sided. So I've spent quite a bit of time in the various Arab states to which migrants arrive. But as you can see from some of these pictures here, I've also spent quite a bit of time in the villages and cities in the sending countries as well, trying to understand both ends of these migration conduits that end in the Arabian Peninsula. So the geography of Gulf migration, this is an older slide of mine, but and there's nothing mathematical about this, but these are some of the predominant states in this Indian Ocean world that send migrants to the Arabian Peninsula. But one of the interesting things that I've discovered about this migration system is that every year when I'm back, there are suddenly these new populations of labor migrants that are present. So in 2010 and 11, for example, I encountered Vietnamese labor migrants in the labor camps for the first time. And lately we're seeing many more West Africans, and including some people from Central Asia as well. So this migration system is always sort of shifting and reaching out to these new sending states, as I try to diagram here with the green arrows. So the scale of Gulf migration also really merits discussion. And so here are some data, and I should note that data are very hard to come by when it comes to Arabia. These numbers are not always available, and while they're gathered by those states, they're not always released for public use. But these are some of the latest statistics that we have, and what it portrays, I think, is what many of us who study the region know, that in total, with these 6 GCC states, and that's Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, there's about 25 million labor migrants that reside and work in those places, which interestingly is about equal to the 26 million citizens that reside in the area. And I want to be perfectly clear here, unlike the migrations that we see in North America and Europe, there's no pathway for these migrants to citizenship or belonging in the states in which they work. These are vast, vast reservoirs of temporary labor that are present on the Arabian Peninsula. And that shapes, I think, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in the remainder of my talk. I think one of the other really interesting and key characteristics about this migration system in Arabia is the kafala, or the sponsorship system, as we call it in English. And this sponsorship system, in short, means that every migrant is associated with his employer and can only arrive after he or she has obtained that employment. So they find their employment prior to arrival and are tied to that employer for the duration of their stay, which is typically organized in 2-year labor contracts. And so this is an unfree labor market. And I think that this really explains why any of you probably already have, or you could go find, plenty of articles that tell these horror stories about migrants in Arabia. But conversely, you can go and easily find migrants there whose families and fortunes were buoyed by their experience there. This variability has to do with the fact that so much is invested in the relationship between the employer and the sponsor. For one migrant who ends up with a perfectly fine sponsor-employer, things are great. For the next migrant who ends up tied for 2 years to an exploitative employer, things are terrible for both him and the family that's behind him, perhaps in South Asia. And I'd also note that we're seeing the continued incremental erosion of this policy, and we're seeing things change for the better, I would argue, in many of the Gulf states for the labor migrants who arrive there, transnational labor migrants. I also want to talk briefly about the migration industry. I think it's fine to talk about what happens in Arabia, but all of these jobs, these 25 million migrants coming and going, that has really given rise to a migration industry, a transnational migration industry. And I've spent some time in Islamabad and Kathmandu and southern India sort of looking into this migration industry, which oftentimes in Nepal, for example, begins with a sub-agent, a dude who walks around to the villages and tries to persuade these young men that their future lies in Dubai. But that includes recruitment agencies in the urban hubs, a lot of related businesses, manpower agencies, training facilities, human resources personnel, and then there's all the stuff on the receiving end as well, the companies that employ them, the places that house them. And then, as William Walters, a political scientist, argued in his article about the deportation industry, he also said we need to think about the airlines and the airports and the buses that are involved in profiting oftentimes from this human mobility. And so thinking about this migration industry helps me sort of conceptualize and include all of these other stakeholders, many of whom are extracting a profit from these transnational movements of humans. And here, just for your information, you can see at one of the labor brokers in Kathmandu the kinds of sheets that they post outside. That's for 238 jobs, welders, plumbers, electricians, tile masons, and it says their pay and the number that are needed, just as an example. So here's another thing that I think is really unique and characteristic of the region, and that's the proportion of migrants to citizens in these Gulf states. So at one end, you have Saudi Arabia with about 63% citizens to 37% nationals. But at the other end, and I would say actually, according to my calculations, Qatar, we have bad data for Qatar here, although it's the only data available, is about 90. Right, 90 to 10. So that's 9 foreign workers for every resident. And so, as those of you who've spent time in that part of the world know, it's really like these cities are like these seas of foreign workers, and unprecedented proportions and balances that we see there. Also, these migrant populations are extraordinarily diverse. My research team did the first ever vast survey of low-income labor migrants in Qatar, and we found 25 different nationalities just in our sample. So drawing from a wide array of sending nations. As an anthropologist, it was easy for me as an American, I suppose, with an interest in social justice, to think through the eyes and the experiences of these migrants. But it was after some time in Qatar and teaching at Qatar University that I really began to also think about the Qatari and the Arab experience in hosting such vast numbers of foreigners and what that means for the preservation of their society and their culture and their traditions as well. And I'll return a little bit to that point in this presentation. So in this portion of the second portion of my talk here, I want to talk a little bit about these migrants' experiences in the metropolises or the cities of Arabia. And so transnational migrants, especially the lower class ones, live a very segregated life in the city. They're sifted and sorted in all kinds of different ways from the front stage of the city. They occupy these peripheral bachelor city and labor camp zones peripheral to the city, and even the shopping malls have family days that sort of sift and sort who's allowed in and who's not. And they're transported, as you saw in one of the previous slides, transported to and from their workplaces on these buses that carry them in and out of the city. So I was, years ago, sitting in my compound when I lived there. And this is my compound. I lived in one of those apartments, flats there. And I was writing some critical field notes about this process of segregation and thinking about what it means for all of these labor migrants who I study to be segregated to these particular portions of the city. I was in my compound with a bunch of other expats or professional level foreign workers like myself. But I mean, look at that picture. Here I am behind a wall with a bunch of other foreigners lamenting about the segregation of these other workers, when it didn't take long for me to sort of realize that, I mean, granted, my conditions are better and my positionality is stronger, but I also was segregated in the space of the city. Foreigners like myself in these designated zones within the city. And so, beginning to think about how this segregation in space in the city was really seemed like a defining element of the Arabian city to me. Well, that led me to this slide. So here, suddenly my mind started expanding with this notion. And you can see what you see if you go to a political or like a pornographic website, you get this censorship pops up in most places in Qatar, in Doha. But not all places. Some places have unfettered access to the internet. And then there's bars and alcohol, not available anywhere in Qatar except for a few designated places. And now with the World Cup coming, they're talking about drinking in fan zones. Again, having these designated spaces where this kind of activity can happen. We could say the same for gender mixed campuses, right? So there's Education City where there's all of these American and European universities that are gender mixed. But outside of those exceptional spaces in the city, you see gender-segregated campuses, including Qatar University, where I taught. And then this last picture on the lower right is the Pearl, an island that was reclaimed from the sea, which means they piled dirt in the ocean and built condominiums on it. But this is the only place where foreigners can buy property. So again, another exceptional space in the city. And so once I started thinking about urban space through this prism, it really helped me see that in my analysis, foreigners, including myself, including the low-income labor migrants, really fall into the same logic that I've described on this previous slide. That the city itself is becoming a tool for sort of sorting, organizing, and governing the Arab states' comprehensive and immersive embrace with the global, with so many foreigners and so many foreign practices there. This foreign matter, the way that they govern it is through urban space. And I, in my forthcoming book, talk at length about this, and also note that we should grasp how integration and assimilation, perhaps, sometimes I feel like they might be Western ethnocentricities that we think with, right? But those premises to our understanding of migration are not at all present in this migration system. And few of the workers I've interviewed over the many years have said they even desire to belong to this particular place. So my concluding thoughts, I'll wrap up quickly. First of all, I want to again assert that regional migration systems are very diverse and complex. and that while, of course, we are thinking with Europe and North America, the two primary migratory destinations, first and foremost, we need to pay attention to these other south to south or other migration systems as best we can, and to understand them for their diversity. As I've sort of hinted here at the end, I see the city itself in Arabia as one of the tools for governing those mobilities in the neoliberal century. And then as I was driving back through the mountains and on the Olympic Peninsula this weekend, I was thinking about Mecca, actually, a city that I'll never see. I would imagine some, if not many, people in this room have seen it. But there's another kind of space of exclusion. I'm excluded from that space, but it's also a space of inclusion. It's a place where, a holy place, where including all Muslims. And so I guess one of the points that I'm continue to tussle with is this dyadic sort of relationship between inclusion and exclusion, and how sometimes these kinds of exclusions can be culturally valuable, for example, in maintaining sort of culture and tradition. And so that's the kind of spatial politics that I'm tussling with nowadays. And I thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Many thanks, Dr. Garner. Let me move to our last speaker. I'm pleased to present Dr. Linda Adhiambo Ocho, who is an established migration expert leading the African Migration and Development Policy Center, a research think tank based in Nairobi, Kenya. As the Executive Director and MAPOC, Dr. Ocho holds a PhD in ethnic relations from the University of Warwick, where she specialized in international migration on African women. She has expanded her research focus to include internal regional migration patterns within the Horn of and Eastern Africa, including projects related to poverty, climate change, and more recently, youth employment and migration. Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak on this panel. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this panel because it's quite diverse, but very similar when I look at when I listen to the experiences of migration in Mexico and the Arabian Peninsula. So mine is actually to give you some perspectives of what's happening in my region, East Africa, which is the area that I focus on. I will dip into the different regions where I am knowledgeable of the information on migration. I will focus mostly on labor migration because I feel like there's an overfocus on forced displacement in Africa, which kind of creates that perspective that a lot of African nationals are moving because of conflict. But actually the reality is Africans are actually moving because of opportunities that may not be available in their areas. And it's an aspect of exploring where is the closest destination where you can actually gain access to those opportunities. So I will actually also draw attention to what are the myths and realities that we're grappling with as a scholar and a researcher in the region. But I'll also mention some of the changing patterns of migration within the region and focus on the continental, regional, and national response to South-South migration. So I'll just skip that one. So within Eastern Africa, we are quite diverse, and we've had a long history of migration, and this has been tied to our colonial ties. When you look at colonialism, you find that migration was controlled by policies, and these policies actually controlled who migrated, even by gender. You find in Kenya that was colonized by the British, they had, similar to in the Canadian situation, they had native reserves. And the only migrants that could move were men who had a native pass. So that actually limited migration of women, but it didn't mean that women did not migrate. Women migrated and found opportunities to create income-generating opportunities. So what was created in the colonial era in terms of migration became a culture of migration. It became almost like a rites of passage where young men and women were seeking opportunities, and for you to be seen as valuable within the household, you would migrate to contribute to the household economy. You still find nomadic movements of the Dinka Dinue in South Sudan, and also the Maasai that cuts across Kenya and Tanzania. But with the recent policies that are being put in place, those nomadic movements are becoming more controlled. And I think it was last year when we had some Maasai pastoralists who had crossed over to the border of Tanzania, and the government of Tanzania confiscated their cattle. So already you can see that certain policies are actually preventing something that has been a natural movement for a historical period of time. So in Africa, we do have mixed migration dynamics, but I always feel, like I mentioned, that we always focus on the displacement question. So just to give you a sense of the different types of migration in East Africa, which is the same in other regions, internal migration is one of the biggest flows, but the aspect that is missing is usually data. And it's because we don't actually have a culture of collecting data on internal migration, and it's quite difficult. We don't actually have a control system that actually tells who to go where. But rural-urban migration is one of the major forms of migration that's happening because of development in urban areas. Rural is still very, it still occurs in many countries, especially those that actually rely on agriculture. Urban is something that is slowly picking up steam, and it's more, you can see it within major cities. In Kenya, it will be Nairobi, Kisumu, Mombasa. I'm sure everyone knows Mombasa. And then urban-rural is still an emerging movement that is coming, especially with the young people, but most people see it as a retirement space, especially for older migrants. And obviously, you know, forced displacement, human trafficking, labor migration and emigration, and also now, more recently, return migration, which is something amongst the diaspora, which is something that's slowly picking up steam, but again, data is something that we don't actually have. So some of the myths, I know most of the time when I go to meetings and you have this idea that migration is, a lot of African nationals are going to Europe. And the Afrobarometer actually conducted a survey that actually found that majority of the migrants stay within the continent, and it's more regional. So when you look at North Africa, you'll find, I believe it's the pink one, it's North Africans going to Europe, and that's because of their historical relations with Europe. And in the other countries, the green part is other regions, other countries within the region. So that's one aspect you do not see that is actually quite prominent in data, that actually African migrants are more likely to migrate within the continent because of opportunities available within the continent and the cost of migration as well. And this is another data set, supposed to be following my slides. Another data that shows the same information that I was talking about. You can see East Africa inflows. Central Africa is more of cheap labor, and that kind of reflects the way the economy or the political systems operate in that region. So it actually determines the type of migration that actually takes place. So I won't go through that. Another myth is that a lot of the drivers of migration are related to conflict. And if you see the one with the orange, with all the orange colors, most of them are seeking employment. So we need to understand that not all migrants are actually running from conflict-related situations. They are migrants that are seeking income-generating opportunities that may not be available in their communities, or their environment are not conducive to actually absorb them. Another aspect that was key, and in many countries, is poverty, and this poverty is more related in the rural areas, but we also do have urban poverty, which is sometimes set aside when we don't look at the facts and we don't have evidence to actually connect the dots. As I mentioned, the patterns of migration are actually changing, and you find that, obviously, the economic is the main driver. And the existing research presents a picture that youth need to be focused on the immediate economic gratification. Young people are looking for quick jobs that give them quick money that meet their immediate needs. But right now, the policies that are related to migration don't actually capture this aspect because it's actually changing. Youth migration dynamics in Kenya is very different from youth migration dynamics in Malawi, and that is basically what we need to unpack. And another aspect that we're seeing is gender is key to understand. The assumption that all young people, all young men and women are migrating for the same reasons and for the same aspects is actually untrue. if you unpack the data and the evidence, because you find that women, young women are migrating, they may be leaving their children behind with their family members, but they're still economically giving back, and they're more likely to contribute to the family that has left behind. So we need to actually try to capture more evidence and data to change our perspectives on how we address migration, and that's in terms of policy and practice. I realize the time is running. So one of the aspects that we were looking at was youth employment and migration. And this is a multi-country study that we're doing in Kenya, Uganda, Malawi, and Zambia. So the reality is migrants are mostly internal, but we do have regional migrants that are actually migrating. Young people are looking for more self-employment opportunities as opposed to employed opportunities, which are sort of limiting. And there's this aspect of the digital era and disconnecting with certain sectors which are not so digitized, and this change of way of working that young people want more freedom to actually earn their right to some form of income. And also the life stage of a youth determines whether you move or stay. This is obvious because married people are more likely to stay in one area and single people are more likely to move. But actually you find that it's actually more depends on needs. So if there's a family that is left behind, there'll be a family that's married, that's the main migrant will move, but will still be facilitating and sending money and income resources to their family. And it's just based on the economy in the country. So why South-South migration? I think it's really important for us to focus on it, and especially in Africa. It's really under-researched. And it's something that we need to understand it from different lenses. And we understand it differently from where I operate, and it's an aspect of need. If policymakers are interested in understanding South-South migration dynamics and how it influences policy, and not at a national level on its own, we also need to understand how it affects at a decentralized level, so at county level or district level. Also, tapping on what Sylvia talked about, media is key in terms of shaping public perceptions about South-South migration. And these days, actually, you don't need a network to actually migrate to another country. You just use social media as an information hub. So how can we actually understand how that actually informs different migration patterns in the region and actually changes the way policy even operates? And why is it important? I mean, migration contributes to development. I think we've talked a lot about it, but I feel like we're kind of shifting it to more on a security lens, even in Africa. So countries need to learn or try to understand their migration dynamics to harness the benefits of migration within their countries, within the region, and within the continent. So in terms of continental response, there are different frameworks. At African Union level, they've developed guiding principles, and the Migration Policy Framework for Africa is one of the tools that they developed in 2006. And it's very similar to the GCM, the one for safe and orderly and regular migration. The only challenge had been implementing it or encouraging countries to mainstream it into their national policies and practices. This framework has recently been revised in 2018. And now the African Union is taking an active role of creating greater awareness of how countries can actually, one, develop their own national migration policies, and the regional economic communities also develop their own migration policy frameworks. And that will allow more synergies, more coordination on migration aspects. The limitations are based on individual country needs, and you find that some of them may not have an interest in migration, so it's about convincing them of why they need to understand migration. And the issue has been always focusing on migration as a problem. When you focus on migration as a problem, then your policies are shaped as problematic. So that's one of the aspects that I've observed based on my engagement with the process. And also at a national level, is convincing them how migration actually benefits them as a country, as a region, as a continent. And this is why when the African Union is talking about African Free Continental Trading Area and the Free Movement Protocol, there has to be a buy-in, member state level and REC level. So this is just an image for you to see the different RECs. There are 8 of them. And in those 8, you find we're multiple. So Kenya is somewhere in the middle there. Kenya is a member of East African Community, COMESA, which is the part of Southern Africa and Eastern Africa Agreement. It's more of an economic agreement, and it's also part of IGAD. So imagine trying to manage, migration, and you're all members of these RECs. And you can find ECOWAS has 15 members, ECAS, which is in North Africa, has 11, COMESA has 19, SADC has 16, EAC has 6, and IGAD has 8. We all have mixed migration flows. So we need to really understand how can we harness it and how can we capitalize it and understand our migration flows. Data is important for doing that. An understanding of how migration actually benefits us as a nation, as a region, as a continent would be key. So I think I will not proceed with my next slides because I feel like the time is up, but I'll be more willing and able to take any responses that anyone may have, or any questions. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Dr. Ocho. I think that there's no time for questions. Unfortunately, we have the minister here. I would like to encourage the attendants to talk and meet the panelists and ask them personally questions, if any. I was told that there's time for one question. No time. Sorry again, many thanks to the panelists and the organizers and all of you.